They, hang on, sorry. They hearkened not unto the voice of their father, because the Lord would slay them. And the child Samuel grew on and was in favor both with the Lord and also with men. And there came a man of God unto Eli and said unto him, Thus saith the Lord, Did I plainly appear upon the house of thy father when they were in Egypt in Pharaoh's house? And did I choose him out of all the tribes of Israel to be my priest, to offer upon mine altar, to burn incense, to wear an ephod before me? And did I give unto the house of thy father all the offerings made by fire of the children of Israel? Wherefore keep ye all my sacrifice and all my offerings, which I have commanded in my habitation, and honorest thy sons above me, to make yourself fat with the chiefest of all the offerings of Israel, my people. Wherefore the Lord God of Israel said it. I said indeed that thy house and the house of thy father shall walk before me forever. But now the Lord said it. Be it far from me, for them that honoreth me I will honor, and they that despise me shall be lightly esteemed. Behold, the day come that I will cut off thy arm and the arm of thy father's house, that there shall not be an old man in thy house, and thou shalt see an enemy in my habitation, and all the wealth which God shall give Israel, and there shall not be an old man in thy house, nor ever, forever. And the man of thine, whom I shall not cut off from thy altar, shall be to consume thy eyes, and to grieve thy heart, and all the increase of thy house shall die in the flower of their age. And this shall be a sign unto thee, that shall come upon my two sons, on Hobart and Phineas. In one day they shall die both of them, and I will rise me up a faithful priest that shall do according to that which is in thy heart and in my mind, and I will build him a sure house, and he shall walk before my anointed forever. And it shall come to pass that everyone that is left in thy house shall come and crouch to him for a piece of silver and a morsel of bread, and shall say, Put me, I pray thee, unto one of the priest's offices, that I may eat a piece of bread.
Thank you all so much. In chapter 2, we have Hannah's prayer, which just in the Holy Imagination book and in our schedule for the summer, we're actually doing Hannah's prayer next week. So we won't focus on that this week, other than I did want to mention, this is, again, there are these sections where prayers or songs or something will come into play to highlight what's going on, either something that's already been written that is brought forth to highlight what's happening and connect it to something that the first readers would have recognized, or to set the stage to say that this is part of something bigger, right? So at the end of Hannah's prayer, the last thing, he will give strength to his king and exalt the power of his anointed. But we know politically in the books thus far, we don't have a king. We've had judges, then we had like a little Ruth interlude, right? And now we're gearing up for Samuel. They're setting up, what is the priesthood going to look like when there's a king, right? And when we look closely at the Holy Imagination book, she's gonna help us see what's happening with that. So I just wanted to highlight that for us before we move forward. Then the book sets up Eli's wicked sons. These folks are not doing what they've been called to do, right? There are particular rituals and particular ways that the priests are taken care of for their livelihood and just being able to survive, right? Food. And they are going about it in a way that is seen as wicked, right? They are countering that ritual. This is in direct correlation with Hannah, right? So Hannah is set up as someone who was barren, who went before the Lord, was misunderstood, and then blessed by the Lord, and then she gave that up, right? She gave the child back to the Lord. And then it says later on that the Lord blesses her with a larger family, right? But all of this, she goes back to the temple. Every year they went back and she brought him a coat and they did this and they did, right? All of that is setting Hannah up as Hannah's being faithful. So her barrenness is not that she's not faithful. It's just setting up that trope, right? In addition to that, it's setting the stage for a direct counter to Eli's sons. Hannah's nobody, right? She's the wife who can't have kids. In that society, she doesn't have any status or power, right? Even the priest disses her at the altar, right? And goes after her. On the other side, you've got Eli's sons who are set up with position, heritage position, right? Because they are the sons of Eli, that's why they're there. And they're set up to do what they've been called to do, and they do counter. And why do they counter? Because of greed, because of selfishness. Hannah's willing to give her child back, the one that she thinks might be her only chance. And Eli's sons, who have everything, are even more selfish and more greedy. So again, I think there's a way that we can talk about this that kind of extends our conversation from the last couple of books in the Bible, but I just wanted to say those couple of things of how these chapters are setting things up, just to kind of highlight them, right? Now, that's not to say that you couldn't counter what I'm talking about, right? So like, if you have a different perspective of how this is playing out, please bring that to the table, because I think that would be crucial. But let's open it up a little bit before we head over to Holy Imagination, because I think Dr. Fentress Williams sets page 89 up to help us see why the book of Samuel is, and even Kings, is set up the way that it's set up. So what do y'all think? What's going on for you?
I like how you explain that.
Oh, okay.
I
So
really do.
yeah. Did that make sense to you? Did it like
Yes.
correlate with what you were thinking?
Yes, I got an aha moment when you were saying that. That was good. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Again, patterns are great, right? Patterns are great. We just got to still be on the lookout for the thing that like isn't fitting the pattern, because that could be a critical move for us too. But thank you so much. I'm glad.
I just thought it's a neat story. I thought Hannah's story is a wonderful story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And it resonates with me because I had fertility issues for a long time.
Yeah. Yep. I was just going to say too that, you know, now there's more talk about fertility issues, right? Or trouble conceiving, or any of the different versions of fertility help that's out there, right? But for a very, very long time, that was never talked about, at least not out in public or like in outside family company, right? It was like just that couple that would be talking about it, or that, you know, somebody with their best friend, and that's it. I don't know what happens on the guy side. You probably just, I don't know, let's go bowling. I don't know. That was stereotypical. That was moving back to like last week when we talked about, you know, the stereotypical like only feelings or only logic. I was just teasing. But yeah, it's such a difficult time for so many people, and there's so much emotion, and there's so much, especially for people who have wanted to have children and have seen their life as one being part of rearing children and rearing biological children, right? It's brutal. It's brutal. And for many, many years, decades and longer, folks just held it. And it wasn't something that was talked about much in public. Even now, miscarriage is something that is, it's talked about more, but it's rarely talked about comparatively. And there are a lot of people who have miscarriages and have never told anybody. And so it's not out of the realm of possibility, right? If we use the language of the author that we're referencing, if we use our holy imagination, if we are considering Hannah being barren, we might also imagine that it is possible that she had miscarriages, that there were times where she thought she was pregnant or could have been pregnant and then was not. So when Hannah goes to the altar and is distraught, right? And is expressing herself in such a way that an outsider, even someone who, a religious leader who we'd hope would have compassion upon her, someone looks at her and says, like, you're drunk, right? If you've ever been in the presence of someone who is in despair and is expressing that, it can take all kinds of forms. It can be absolutely chaotic, and to try to name some sort of order or something that makes sense on top of it often just hinders the person from being able to express freely what's going on with them. So, Sister Marion, I appreciate not only you bringing that forward for us, but also sharing part of your personal story too. These are, we can talk about this as if it's like just this biblical something, right? But there are very real connections with our lives that that can touch us in particular ways, right? Can illuminate things, but can also, kind of hit us in some kind of way too.
The other thing that I saw was familiar to me was the way that this story is set up when you talk about a man having two wives. Whenever that comes up in the Bible, there's always one who's favored with regard to fertility issues and one is not. Mm-hmm. Just to show a reversal later on, that things aren't the way they appear to be.
Yeah, why do you think that is? I mean, no pressure. Just answer it for just answer it for us all, would you? No.
I think that it has a lot to do with appearances and how we may look upon people who appear to be not in favor, when in fact they really turn out to be most favored over those who appear to be favored, if that makes sense.
Okay. And that comes up a lot too, right? The Lord sees what humans do not see. So the youngest is chosen instead of the eldest, or the barren wife is the favored one, right? And we talked, I can't remember if it was last week or a couple of weeks back, that we talked about, oh, now I can't remember. Sister Marion, jump right in. My brain fell out.
I think it's a touching love story between the man and Hannah. I mean, he could have been dismissive of her, but he favored her. He saw something in her, and he wasn't condemning. In fact, he gave her more food than she was really entitled to. And I think that story in the story is a nice story as well.
Thank you so much, Sister Marion, because I was getting there and then my brain fell out. And then you brought that up. And because I was thinking about how we talked about romanticizing love, right? for Ruth. And I think we talked about it before too, right? But here it's like very clear. It's like, hey, I'm giving you this because, right? And the language of like, aren't I worth more than 10 sons? It's like, no, you're not. Because in this world that we actually live in, you know, Guy, Elkanah, if I don't have 10 sons, that's on me. So yeah, you're great. And the food, awesome, wonderful. But what am I going to do without 10 sons? Right? I mean, that's so as much as this is going on, like how do we like understanding that, yes, this is the pressure of what she's feeling, right? She's feeling all that pressure, whether or not she says that to him or not, right? That would be, whoo, that'd be pretty bold, especially for that time. But the reality is that she has that pressure upon her. She is not considered of worth until she starts bearing sons. And here she is barren. And here is this husband who's got a productive other wife and is still showing care, right? I think we talked about that with Ruth, right? It was like showing care or provision or Naomi weeping. I think that was brought up last time, right? It was like, you don't weep over somebody that you just have some sort of like societal obligation over, right? There are cues that he is invested in her and not based in the value that society would give her. But there's something going on there, right? Thank you so much. That's good.
Well, even though he's trying to be, and he's doing his best to be understanding, but like you say, he misses the mark in not giving, being sensitive to the fact that a woman's got to bear not just children, but male children to be considered anything. But he's doing his best. So he's giving her more food. He's saying,
Yeah,
you know, why are you crying? You know, I love you, blah, blah, blah. So even doing his best, he's still kind of missing the mark. But hey, you know, you just do the best you can.
you know what I was saying? You know what I was thinking when you were saying? So I was thinking in my, you know, there's different ways to approach infertility or fertility trouble, right? And one is like reducing the stress of before pregnancy, right? Or to prepare space for pregnancy. But of course, when you're trying to get pregnant and you can't, there's more and more stress. It like compounds itself. So it's harder to reduce the stress, right? And so when he's like, why are you weeping? It's like, look, first you got to stop. It's like a logical thing, right? This is where my mind, look, woman, you got to stop weeping, because the more you're weeping and tripping out at the altar, this is not how this is done. Like, remember how our mothers and grandmothers and 14 generations back said, you got to calm down because you're not good. This is not the way it's going to happen. And then he's like, look, why don't I fatten you up? Give you some more food?
Well, maybe she, you know, the not eating part, it's just mentioned, but that could have been a serious part of it. She wasn't nourishing her body, and maybe she was having an eating disorder. You know, she was under a lot of stress. So we don't know, you know, that phrase about she wasn't eating. And then after she prayed, she went and ate, or after the priest said, you know, blessings to you or whatever, then she went and ate.
Right. Or just anemic.
She might have been anemic.
Right. Just, I mean, there are things that we know about with, you know, biology and nutrition and all of that kind of stuff that they're not going to write in the biblical text, right? And again, this is us using our holy imagination based on perspectives that we have now through science and otherwise, right? And experience. We're looking at some of the text and saying, like, it's not just because, you know, Hannah went on a food strike or something, right? There could have been biological things that were going on too.
Sure. You know, and it said that her countenance was no more sad. So she, you know, she was probably depressed, and she became less depressed.
Right. Sister is it EL? I'm so sorry.
It's either one. You can call me EL or Edith. Just call me.
Okay. Yes, ma'am. Please share.
My comment is, let's take a look at the other wife and her cruelness and her lack of understanding and sympathy and empathy, as opposed to what we discussed last week in the relationship between Ruth and her mother-in-law and the other woman that was there, the friendship and the closeness and the understanding between the women. But in this story, the two wives, and Hannah was I see her, and I guess this is my imaginary, I see her as a kind, soft, gentle spirit. And I see her husband seeing the same thing in her. And perhaps that's why she is favored. And the other wife, who has the sons, gave children, but there's a quality of meanness within her. Because anyone that would irritate someone else because of what they do not have is not a nice person. And so I don't see the second wife as being a good person. But again, I cannot find that in the text, only the fact that she irritated, and she purposely irritated Hannah. She did it on purpose. So that, in a combination of not eating and the other things, could have contributed to the fact that she was not being able to bear children.
Thank you so much. Dr. Bowling, I saw you nodding your head as soon as
Well, I was thinking like EL, and I was thinking that, what was her name? Kenaz was also always irritating him and throwing it up in her face, about, I've got sons and daughters, you don't have anything. And this TJ was reading about how she kept approaching her, even when they would go to the temple. Kenaz was still messing with Hannah. So she not only had the fact that she was sterile, but she had the fact that I'm living with this woman who's got all these sons and daughters, and I've got to take her wrath every day, and hear what she's got, So there was no love there at all, except that you don't see Hannah fighting back. Yes.
Yeah. And let's see. Peninnah, she is listed first. So we might assume that she is the first wife. And if that's the case, then in that society, she would have had top billing. She would have been the top wife. But Hannah, in the text, it shows that the husband is favoring her. So again, I mean, it's probably impossible for us to attribute, what they're thinking or their motivations and, beyond what's there. But it could be that she believed, okay, I'm the first wife. This is how my life's going to go. Right. And I'm going to have the favor of my husband. I'm going to be the favorite wife. And no matter how many kids she produced, no matter how many sons she produced, he was still favoring Hannah. Now,
in my version, Hannah is listed first. And he had two wives. The name
Yeah,
one
mine
was
had
named
Hannah first.
was
Right.
Hannah, and the name of the other was
Then I'm
Penina.
then I'm talking smack. I don't know. I mean, again, right? That's if that's the case, right? I was making it based on my mistake, right? My error, because that's how it says it in mine too. I was just I flipped it. So if that's the case, like we could do some research about it, right? And figure it out. But if that's the case, then my whole argument falls apart. And that's why it's so important. Like, where do you see that in the text? Where is it coming from? Because then we can tear apart my argument. Sister Marion.
And also, Penina is listed in my version as an adversary to Hannah. So it's clear that, Penina, like Yvonne was saying, is not a nice person, or the other woman. She was not loving and kind to her
Right.
other wife. But when you have multiple wives, I can see that happening. All right.
Well, let's just even talk about blended families, right? Because back then we're talking about like multiple wives, two Two is nothing.
Who's not?
You know, back then it's like, what, you're just starting? What, how many goats do you have? What's the problem? How come you don't have more wives by now? Why are you so busy bothering Hannah? Why don't you just go out and get some more wives, right? This is just part of how society worked, right? So he's got his two wives or whatever. But even if we talked about blended families, even in the best of circumstances where everybody is actively trying to work together, there are ways that can get tripped up, right? I mean, jealousy is a very real thing, and assumptions are a very real thing. And when we place our assumptions into, you know, if they do this, that means this, right? And then, and that gets all mucked up. And then we got jealousy on top of it. Forget it, right? Now, I'm not trying to say, you know, we should just be tearing each other up and all that kind of stuff. I'm not advocating for that. I'm just saying that there's this dynamic that's going on, right? And at some point in our world, we have to try and figure out how we can attend to that or how we can address that, right? Because left unchecked, it can bring misery in a whole bunch of different ways, not only just with the adults who are in play, but for the kids too, right? For the children too.
Mhm.
So yeah, that's good. I love how you said that. I love how you brought that forward. Like, oh, my version does this. My version does too. Oops. So one, thanks for the correction. But two, it's a perfect example of like how we do this study critically, right? When we name what we're talking about as explicitly as we can find the part in the argument like, oh, wait a minute, this whole line doesn't work anymore, right? And that's okay. It's all right for us to like juggle back and forth. Okay, what else? Do we want to move quickly to the Holy Imagination introduction, or do you want to stay here?
Are we going to get into Eli's rebuke of being rebuked by
Sure, let's do that.
in chapter 2?
Yeah, let's do it. Because we're still going to be in
He knew
1
his-
Samuel next week. So
Right. He knew his sons were doing the wrong thing. And it's interesting how they said, you know, the priest had that 3-pronged fork and stuck it in there, and everything that he brought out belonged to him. And then here come the sons, and they're making the other people say, you know, give me everything that you got, just the raw meat, you know. These poor people, they didn't have anything if we are to know that they weren't that rich. Or even if they were, the priests and the priest's sons were taking everything away from them by force. And Eli knew that.
right. And they're using because for them, being religious leaders is also political leaders, right? So when we think religious leaders, we might think of like cordoned off from other power, right? But what they're talking about is like, if you're a religious leader, you're the political leader too. So here you've got folks who are in religio-political power, right? And what the ritual, right, the theological move, the offering to God is to boil the meat. And then the fat that gets boiled off is actually part of the sacrifice. And so when the priests come in with the 3-pronged fork and they pierce the meat and bring it out, they're piercing the meat. The fat has already been boiled off, and that remains for the sacrifice. They're stealing from the people, but they're stealing from God. And Eli's like, yeah, I know, but right. So, and that becomes a problem. It's like, it's not only these two, right? Here's a key thing probably for us too, right? It's not just these two dudes in power who are stealing from God and roughing up the people. but it's Eli who becomes the standby, the bystander who's being rebuked. Even though, like, and in this case, the bystander is the parent. And there's going to be consequences to that. There are consequences not only from abusing the power from the two sons who are abusing the power, but there are also consequences to the bystander. And his status as their father doesn't save him from that. Thank you so much for highlighting that. What do we think about it?
Well, I think it's interesting that that was brought up because Hannah gave up her son, you know,
Right.
willingly gave up her son,
Right.
prayed for him and everything. And yet Eli's sons are going to be killed. And he's already been warned that, you know, your sons are going to die on the same day. So he lost something. He lost his son. Actually, Hannah gained something by having a son and giving the son up to God.
Mm-hmm.
So, kind of dichotomy
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, yeah. And also, just because you're in religious and political power, just because you hold the most power in the community, doesn't mean that there aren't obligations and responsibilities. It's not just like, oh, you have this, that's it, that's the end of the story. Everybody has an obligation to this society. And when they don't fulfill that, there are consequences to it. Hannah, right? Hannah is getting it from all sides, except her husband, right? Is getting hit from all sides about not being able to do what society requires of her, right? To fulfill her responsibility, but it's beyond her control, right? And so even so, in another contrast, she's being set up as the faithful one, even though society would mark her as being unfaithful. Sisters, El, please.
This Eli does say something to his sons,
Mhm.
but they don't listen.
Right.
And could the message also be, you cannot train an adult? Training children, you train a child so that they grow up to do the right thing. These are now men who have perhaps been doing things that have not been pleasing to God for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And nothing was said as their father stood by and said, well, you know, what are you going to do? But then when he starts hearing more and more reports and he goes to them to basically, you know, to ask them to change their ways, stop doing it, they do not listen. And so the little lesson in that I see is that you cannot teach adults. It starts from the beginning.
Mm.
Again, that's probably my imagination.
No, I mean, I think that so when I'm thinking about it, I'm like, well, first of all, now I got to give up my job, right? Because my whole, not here, but my whole job is like teaching adults. I'm like, oh no. So then I'm like, well, I guess I'm done. But in the same way though, right? Maybe it's just Eli can't speak to him anymore. Because Eli just like you just said, Eli as a parent has spent his whole life allowing this going on, right? So even if it is that adults can be taught or could change or some miracle happen, maybe it's not going to come from Eli because they're already set in that dynamic. They're always like, yeah, what's he going to do? He's not going to do anything. He hasn't done anything up until now. He's not going, why is he coming in right now trying to say stuff, right? Yeah, what do you think about that? Sister Marion's coming in after too.
Oh, as far as what you're, yeah, I do. I do see your point that it can, because what the statement that I made means that no one can learn after a certain point. That really wasn't what I was trying to say, but your point is valid that direction and insight can come from all directions. And it may not necessarily be the parent. The parent could try and try and try, but someone else's voice. Sometimes there needs to be another voice in one's ear in order for one to take action. So yes, I do agree with you wholeheartedly.
Yeah, and I agree with you too. Like for Eli to spend all of that time not saying anything or being ineffective about it, right? He's already set that dynamic with them. And perhaps that's what makes it too late, right? It's already a different kind of dynamic that to interrupt that momentum would be close to impossible.
Yes.
Yeah. Sister Marion, you want to jump in?
Well, I couldn't find in my reading where Eli had been neglectful in trying to teach his sons. So I'm not sure where we're getting that from. And I took it as, well, my own perspective, even as a parent, you cannot live your children's lives.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can say all you want to say from day one.
Mm-hmm.
And people will be who they're going to be, even if they're there, even if they are your children.
Mm-hmm. Brother Thomas and then Sister Leandra, please.
Yeah, Eli wasn't negligent in not teaching them. I think that he was negligent in not taking them out of that position of responsibility. It's like, I reflect back on my upbringing and my father, he would tell me something one time, that's it. And the next time would solve the problem. So I think that Eli has a responsibility to take them out of that position of responsibility that they had.
I'm just thinking of political realities right now. Thank you. Sister Leandra.
This story reminded me of I knew a Pentecostal preacher, and she raised her children with a firm hand and expected them to be righteous children. And then the moment they reached adulthood, they immediately decided they had like been freed from a prison or something. And they went in a totally opposite direction, and just to defy her all of her years of training and teaching and thinking she had led them on a righteous path. And their whole goal was to get off that path the moment they were of legal age. Unfortunately, one of them married a woman and was very abusive to her. One of her sons was very abusive to his wife. And mom was always saying she didn't understand how that happened because she had raised him to respect women and all of this. But his whole life, he was just waiting for the moment where he could be free of his mother's teachings and religious principles. So unfortunately, like it was said by the previous speaker, you can't always determine the outcome of how your children will be, what type of adults they will be. You can hope that you pour something into them and then later, after, even if they stray, that they will come back to whatever good thoughts and stuff was instilled in them. Anyway.
Yeah, even when we brought up, when we looked at Samson, you know, in the book of Judges, and we talked about what it might be like to live under the pressure of, you know, being the chosen one, being the, you know, the one who's going to this, the one who's going to that, set apart to blah, 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 and all these things. And it doesn't excuse abuse of power or literal abuse. It doesn't excuse any of that. But if we reverse engineer it, it might help us to think about, you know, what kind of expectations we place on people to begin with. It doesn't take away the responsibility to address what's going on now, but it also gives us a both and. You know, how do we go about treating one another, even raising generations, to avoid this kind of like pushback, pullback kind of thing? And then how do we balance that against individual responsibility? There's communal and individual responsibility that's going on throughout this whole thing. In the book of Ezekiel, God says, hey, Ezekiel, this is Michelle's paraphrase. Hey, Ezekiel, the folks are acting up. Go tell them about it. And if they don't listen to you, that's on them. Your job is to say something. Their job is to take responsibility for what they do after you say something. Now, Ezekiel, if you don't say anything, that's on you. That's how God said it. No. But that's the story, right? It's like, are we responsible to like change other people? There's only so much we can do, right? What does that mean for us to act faithfully, but also be in collective responsibility, for our society, to bear one another up, that kind of thing. Brother Thomas, did you want to jump back in before we end our time together?
Yeah, I wanted to ask the question based on a comment that you made about the political ramifications of Eli taking them out of that out of those positions of responsibility. What would have been the political consequences of that?
Well, I mean, the system at that point was set up to have priests there. That would have been part of a lineage. So there would have, the first move would have been to replace the two of them with someone who was coming from that house, right? The group that was producing priests, right? Priesthood. So that would have been the first thing. If there weren't anybody available, we'd probably have a different biblical story that would talk about how they ended up there, right? Because it would have been like, some of these biblical stories are set up to be like, how did we end up with a king, right? If we were all led directly by God, how in the world did we end up with a king? And that's how we've got this transition between like judges. Now we're getting into prophet. Then we're getting to king, right? So if there were nobody left in the house of the priesthood to take the spot of Eli's sons, then we'd probably have some story somewhere that explained that. How did these folks end up there? And the story would have been bigger depending on how outrageous it seemed that they were going to be there. So I don't know specifically. We could probably do more research on that. That's some of what biblical scholars do, and some of what we could do in Bible study is to kind of research like, hey, what's going on there? Did Eli have some other sons? Were there daughters that just didn't make it into the story? That kind of thing. Brother Charles, please. And then Sister Marion, and then we're going to close out.
I was just thinking what if the biblical story was, we never see in any of the biblical stories where it's the man's fault that his wife is not productive. I mean, they're always the other way around. And we know in society today, that's not true, but it's the way the stories are written. But I was just thinking about it and saying, well, that's a slant. I mean, that's just sort of the way it is. It's just curious to me that that's just what we see in the Bible.
Excellent point. And it sets a stage for us in our further interpretive journeys, right? It's like, oh, we never see it like that. Perfect example. Perfect. Sister Marion, you want to jump in?
Oh, just a closing comment on Eli. You pointed out how you would think as a priest, you would have some compassion for Hannah when she was praying and silent. He's maybe not a good reader of people. And so he didn't get it. He should have gotten it when she was praying. Maybe his sons have fooled him through their youth, just kind of pulled the wool over daddy's eyes because daddy will believe, some stuff that's not true, or think some stuff that's not true. So I don't, Eli I think he's just not a very good read of people.
That's good. Yep. And it touches so many of the things that we talked about too. I think, Sister Marion, it would be wonderful because of all of your, ways of pulling all of these things together right at the end. Would you like to pray us out of this time together? See what I did there?
Almighty God, thank you for the moments we've been able to spend one with another and with you, reading these sacred stories and trying to find lessons for our own lives so that we can be better people, one with another and one with thee. Amen.
Amen. Wonderful. Thank you all so much. Well, I know some of y'all come back for 7 p.m. Guess who's going to be there? Me.
Oh, good, good.
We'll start with the reading of the biblical text and see where it goes. We'll start the same way and see where the conversation takes us.
Thank you.
Great session. Great session. Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you
great
all. Y'all
afternoon,
made it
everybody.
so.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. I'll see you later this evening, Reverend Michelle.
Okay, wonderful.